So, as a pregnant woman, I'm greatly concerned that I really hope to have a healthy baby, and since I know something about what the risks are, it's very disturbing to think about, what pregnant women face and what the risks of birth defects due to pesticide exposure are. If I happen to be a Minnesota farm worker, my risk of having a baby born with a birth defect would be 1.6 times greater than a member of the general public. If I were a woman living in rural areas in Argentina, where Monsanto's enormous soy plantations are being grown and where horrible amounts of Roundup are being sprayed all over the local community, a rural woman in Argentina, she has a 46 times greater chance than I do of having a baby with a birth defect. If I were a woman living in Vietnam, where Agent Orange was used back during the Vietnam War, even today, the rate of birth defects is extremely high in Vietnam, and I would be 131 times more likely to have a baby born with a birth defect.
When the Supreme Court mandated that the USDA needed to do a environmental impact statement on transgenic alfalfa before it was released in January of 2011, the USDA couldn't do an independent environmental impact statement. They could only cut and paste information provided them by Monsanto. So there was no meaning to the order from the Supreme Court that a environmental impact statement be done, because no independent, objective, third-party, long-term study was possible. The only studies on the safety of transgenic food have been done by Monsanto on a 90-day basis. So no long-term examination, multi-generation examination of the issues, food safety and health issues related to these products has ever been done. That's part of what's wrong with the system that we've been operating under. But Monsanto's money reaches into all of the land-grant colleges and all the agricultural research institutions in huge ways, so that I know researchers and professors who've told me that their dean has said, don't you ever say anything against transgenic agriculture, simply because of the money that it means for that institution, not only from Monsanto, but from other companies involved. There's 1,000 companies now in the biotech industry. They're all heavily in support of this. Plus, the whole agribusiness community is supportive of what Monsanto is doing. And they've been a problem even back 30 years ago when I was working on the farm issue years ago. Back then, we were simply trying to keep farmers in business. Back when we rolled tractors, the main issue was at that time to keep farmers on the land, because farmers are a resource, a democratic resource, as much as they are an economic resource. And we knew that we were developing a system of agriculture that couldn't be sustainable. It's hugely dependent on chemicals, and it's also dependent on fossil fuels, so that imagine now with gas prices and diesel prices what they are now, if they go up a little bit more, what it's going to do to the agricultural system. And we're dependent on big tractors, big equipment, bank loans, all these things. And back then, what we wanted to do was to keep as many farmers from being put out of business by the way in which policy actually was driving farmers off the land. And even worse than that, back in 1980, a group of farmers from the American Agriculture Movement went up to the White House and had a meeting there with Stuart Eizenstat, who was President Carter's domestic policy advisor. And Eizenstat said to them, we are going to see that you can never do this again, because Carter was mad at farmers for weakening his political position by coming and doing what they did. And especially, there were a lot of farmers from Georgia that were involved in that movement, and they had a tractorcade on Plains, Georgia, even before the tractorcade to Washington, so that they were after Carter long before that. We didn't know what Stuart Eisenstadt had in mind, but we now do. Stuart Eisenstadt now is the senior scientist at APCO International. I'm sorry, the senior advisor at APCO International. And APCO International, if you remember, was the organization that put together for the tobacco industry the AstroTurf organizations that they used to defend themselves against the claims that tobacco was bad, was unhealthful. APCO International is now being employed also by Monsanto to do the same thing for them on this issue. And together with the Farm Bureau, which is a major promoter of agribusiness interests, they've put together an AstroTurf organization, just one of several that they've put together, which is called the Farmer and Rancher Alliance. And you can look it up. You can Google that name and you can find out about who they are and who created them and what they're doing. They are an organization of state Farm Bureau chapters from all over the United States, Monsanto, other biotech companies, and some other agribusiness interests. And because so many farmers are involved in their system of agriculture, they have even gotten the federal government to give them checkoff money, which is money that all farmers pay in to the government to help with public relations and research activities related to the crop. So they've got checkoff money now from the federal government to support this AstroTurf organization. Fundamentally, I expect them to be fighting us tooth and nail. They've been in existence now for maybe it's close to a year. I don't think it's quite a year yet, but it's coming along in time. So, and then there's another organization that's a little older called the Center for Food Integrity. How do you like that for a name? That is totally an industry AstroTurf organization designed to promote the system of agriculture that they think is wonderful and they think it's going to save the world. Bill Gates just recently, Bill Gates came out with a strong statement in favor of the transgenic agricultural system and how they're going to use it in Africa to help people over there. Well, meanwhile, the United Nations has a study that says that organic system of agriculture is what the people in this part of the world need in order to be able to protect themselves and nourish themselves properly, in order to be able to have an agricultural system that works. So we do have some allies, but we don't have allies with the kind of money that they have in order to be able to get this work done. Not only that, but to get back a minute to the question of the research, there's a study in Russia where they've studied now multi-generations. As I said, nobody's done that in the United States, and nobody had done it anywhere else until they started to do it in Europe. And Europe is a lot more sensitive on these issues than we are. There's nations in the European Union that totally ban transgenic crops. Italy, for example, has 30% of their farmers who are organic. 30% of their land is organic in Italy. We're 1% of the land in the United States that's organic, and it ranges in Europe down maybe some are 5%, 9%, 10%. You know, there's a range in different European countries, but there are a good-sized group of European countries that now ban totally. And in Hungary, last summer, they actually tore up 1,000 acres of corn that proved to be transgenic simply because it violated their ban. They completely eradicated it. Now, the health issue. In Russia, under the aegis of the Russian Academy of Sciences, they did study that showed that the problems of genetic contamination do not begin to show up in the first generation, or even a great deal so much in the second generation, but by the third generation, they are enormous. So that they were seeing in their mice and hamster populations 50% mortality. And huge, and this is also anecdotally told in the United States with animals here, where fertility is affected not just by the crop, but also by the contamination with glyphosate. There's a doctor in Argentina, Dr. Carrasco, who has documented the fertility effects on people living near these no-till farms just from the spray drift getting on the people. Now, this is a huge issue because that glyphosate and Roundup is used on the roadsides, it's used on the railroad tracks, it's used in urban areas, it's used all over the place, and we're finding now that in Germany, it's showing up in the urine of city people in much above any level that should be tolerable. So that if we tested us, the likelihood is that our urine would also show high levels of glyphosate in it right now with unknown effects, because if you don't know, you're not looking for the effects. If you're not of childbearing age, you may not be looking to find out, what it is that's causing the problems that you're confronting. But here we are with a huge problem that's been swept under the rug that is equally as big a problem, if not bigger, than DDT. And yet, you got a big company with lobbying power, with campaign contributions influencing the Congress. It's one reason why I was interested in this lawsuit, because I knew from having done it that it would take millions of dollars and millions of people to lobby the Congress against the power that it has to keep this train on the trolley in favor of transgenic agriculture. That's important to them. It's a huge fight. So we thought that by bringing a lawsuit, we might be able to get a favorable decision from a judge who would begin to see the issues in our way. Well, we didn't. Our case was dismissed at the end of February by the judge in New York. We think the decision was very bad, but it'll take us a year to appeal it. And the appeals court of the Federal District in Washington, which is the court we go to, is a notoriously pro-business court. So we don't necessarily get it fixed there either. We might, in the end, have to file a new case and try to get to another judge and maybe do some things a little differently than we did. But nonetheless, we feel we have a strong case to win on appeal and bring it back and keep going. It's just the time that it takes to get that done. So what are we doing? First of all, as I said, we're after that protection against patent infringement lawsuits. But in order to do that, we need to show what's wrong with what they're doing. You don't just get it on the basis of we want this protection. You have to make a series of arguments about what they're doing. We have 4 basic categories of arguments that we make. First, we argue that their patents should be invalid, should never have been issued. We will argue with evidence now from around the world that a basic tenet of patent law was not met in granting these patents. That tenet says that patents should only be issued to products that have public utility. There's a precedent that goes back to the early part of the 19th century with Judge Story on the Supreme Court, when he said, you can't patent anything to poison the people. We are invoking that standard and trying to resurrect it in a country which now wants to slide things like this under the rug because they're not so, it's like what George H.W. Bush said when they released this product originally in 1992. I'm in the business of deregulating. Come see me. That's what he told the industry. So they came and saw him, and the release of this without examination was done just because regulation on businesses' ability to make profit was a bad thing to that Republican president. And I have to say that Democratic presidents haven't been a whole lot better in the time since then because they can count the votes. Are you asking a question?
No, I was just agreeing.
Right. Sure.
How long does it take for the soil to rejuvenate after this has happened?
It's a very good question. It takes glyphosate 25 years to get out of the soil. Now, there are certain circumstances that can vary that some, but that's the time it takes to break down. And we're operating an organic industry on the basis of 3 years to get back to do organic crop. But glyphosate doesn't break down. It can be released and put into the groundwater and into the water table. And USGS just did a study within the last 6 months or so that showed that over a 15-year period, the amount of glyphosate in the Mississippi River Basin had increased 8-fold. So there's been, over that period of time, with this system of agriculture, a huge increase in the amount of it being used. This is why I say that this problem, the combined problem of the health effects and environmental effects of this system of agriculture with the seeds and the herbicide, is as big an issue as global warming because of the huge, broad impacts in making it so our soil cannot produce healthy food anymore.
Have there been any studies on the impact on fish and sea life in the rivers and stuff? And have you thought about combining with that industry, fisheries, to beef up your
Right.
case?
Those studies have not been made, but it stands to reason that if you're putting that much onto the soil, that some of it is getting into the water. And the USGS studies looks at this, how much is getting into that Mississippi basin, going down the river, getting into the Gulf, but nobody's done the studies to see what it's, but if it's having the impact that it's having on animals. And incidentally, the impact of glyphosate in very, very tiny quantities can have huge health impacts. So that these also are aspects of this that have not been thoroughly examined. It doesn't take a large amount. Not only that, but now, because the system of agriculture is not really working, not only do you have weeds now that are resistant to glyphosate and not dying, so that they're having to use a cocktail of ever more potent herbicides in order to kill them, but you've got corn borer and other insects that are also developing resistance more. I know a farmer who I worked with in the American Agriculture Movement for many, many years, and he's an ex-president of the American Agriculture Movement, who farms in Nebraska, and he says, when we started with this system, most of those farmers, incidentally, that I worked with back then and know still, and at least the ones that are still in business, they're basically in the tank with Monsanto because they have to use the system in order to be able to compete and survive in farming. I know another farmer who said, I will not eat the crap that I grow. When I go to the grocery store, I go straight to the organic counter. I do not go anywhere where I might get anything that I've grown because I know what it is. Well, this farmer that I'm mentioning in Nebraska, he said we have one application of Roundup was supposed to do it. That was all we needed to use in order to kill the weeds for the season. But now it takes 4 treatments. So you've got that much more going on. That's how you get this 8-fold increase in the amount of it in the river basin, because in order to do the work. But Dow now has a crop out that's resistant, a corn crop that's resistant to 2,4-D. So that they can spray 2,4-D on the soil now in order to be able to grow corn. And 2,4-D, as you may know, is the major ingredient in Agent Orange. And it has huge health impacts well beyond the cancer issues and well beyond the glyphosate impacts on fertility.
If fisheries are feeding fish corn, the Monsanto
Bingo.
corn,
Bingo.
and cows are being fed the Monsanto corn,
Aren't the people who are eating those fish and those cows and that beef, whatever, also getting the glyphosate?
Yes. In a word, yes.
Yeah, you use the term transgenic, and you say you like that term. Is that to distinguish this kind of like break between, because, Monsanto likes to argue, well, look, farmers have manipulated genes, animal husbandry and plant breeding and blah, blah, blah. But this is a fundamentally different order of what's going on with it breaks from that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
They make the point that modify this, modify that. I modify my clothes. I modify my car. What's the big deal? That's and in fact, even the president of the Farmers Union, when they were releasing transgenic alfalfa, Roger Johnson is his name, and he's a former agricultural commissioner from the state of North Dakota. He said, we got contamination in all of us already. So what's the big deal? The big deal is that this contamination is self-replicating. So that once you have it in the gene pool, you're putting it everywhere. And now we know that those genes that are getting into the livestock are getting into the meat, are getting into the milk and the fish. Farm-raised fish, anyway, that are fed grains. Yeah, that's right. So all these things are the problem that we're up against. And with alfalfa, you've got an even bigger problem. First of all, only 7% of the alfalfa has ever used herbicide. Alfalfa, if you've ever grown it, is a robust crop that will squeeze out weeds on its own. It doesn't need herbicide if it's grown in healthy soil. But now they've weakened the soil so that when they try to grow alfalfa in this depleted soil that doesn't have what a crop needs to grow, it won't do its job. The weeds are competing with it, and so you've got to have the herbicide in order to even grow alfalfa. So that's why they're trying to. But the biggest problem is that alfalfa is a crop that is pollinated by bees. It's not a self-pollinating crop, and bees have a radius of about 5 miles. So you're getting now spreading of it, and the plant pathologists say that all alfalfa will be transgenic within about 5 years under this system. And because alfalfa is the 4th largest crop grown in the United States, and it's used by organic farmers, by everybody that feeds livestock, in addition to the grain that they feed, you get it everywhere. Right now, I would not eat anything, any meat in this country unless it's been totally pastured. And actually, we now know that grain-fed meat is very bad for your health. The fats that get into meat as a result of grain feeding cause it to be instantaneously unhealthy for the heart. But not only that, but you can't keep cows healthy when they're fed grain. Cows are not designed to eat grain. They're designed to eat grass. So that when you feed them nothing but grain, as they do in the feedlots, they get sick. And when they get sick, they have to be fed antibiotic. So you're getting meat that's laced with antibiotic. That's also meaning that the antibiotics are not going to be useful for the things that we need them for. 80% of the antibiotics sold in this country are sold in the livestock marketplace to be fed to animals. That's where we are.
I have two questions. One is, I heard that the USDA organic certification now actually allows transgenic things to be labeled organic. Is that true?
No. Let me explain. If you know that an organic product has transgenic content, there's a zero tolerance standard. However, there's a loophole that has not been closed. Badly needs to be closed, but and the effort has been made to close it. In fact, Bryce Lundberg of Lundberg Rice told me personally about his efforts to get the Organic Trade Association to set an action level on transgenics, so that if you were obliged to find out if you had contamination, test in order to find out if you had contamination, and then do something about it, because that's what exists for pesticides. To know about it. But in transgenics, you can have 50% contamination if you don't know about it. And there has been a 365 cereal product at Whole Foods that the Cornucopia Institute has found 50% contamination. It's not an organic product, but it's a natural product a cereal product and you can read about it on the Cornucopia Institute's website, because the study is public and available. So you get these kinds of things. What actually happens, in fact, is that people who grow a crop that gets contaminated, they don't want anybody to know about it. They push it out. They sell it wherever they can. If they have integrity, in some cases they let it go into the organic market. There's an incentive for unscrupulous operators not to know by the way this program works, so that they can let it out into the organic market. In that sense, you're right, but it's still a little bit of it's not as bad as saying that it's actually permitted under the basic standards. It's this loophole that enables people to get into the crop. I know, for example, a farmer who grew some contaminated corn to feed his organic dairy cattle, and he was allowed to do that under the program. The contamination, the minor contamination that he knew about that was in the seed that he planted, was acceptable for seed to be gotten from a source. He couldn't get it from an organic source, so he got it from an alternative source up in Canada, and this was acceptable under the standard. But it does let contamination in. However, we have the Non-GMO Project, which is telling the world, these particular products are free of any transgenic ingredients, but they aren't. Even the Non-GMO Project allows 0.9%, just less than 1%, contamination in their products. And they wouldn't be able to get the cooperation of manufacturers if they didn't have something like that. Because when you've got that kind of a standard, what they do, and the big co-ops, grower co-ops do this too, if they find they've got some contaminated crop because of pollen blew over or whatever happened, they mix it to get below the threshold that even they sell it into Europe. They get below that 0.9% and sell it into Europe. But nobody has done ever any studies to say that even that level is safe. We don't know what level is safe because the studies in this country have never been made. And we know that it's self-replicating, and we know that if it gets into your gut, it gets into the gut bacteria, and if you've got that pesticidal bacteria in your gut or the herbicidal bacteria, you're going to affect the bacteria, the good bacteria that you need to digest your food. So that you are beginning to have all these things being noticed and being figured out, but we still don't have in this country the thorough studies to really go into it in any kind of depth. And if you would ask the Congress to do that, you'd have to look and see where they're getting their funding from. We know that in the 2008 campaign, the Obama campaign got half of its money from the people in small contributions, but the other half came from the big players with the large contributions. And now you've got the door wide open with the Citizens United decision. So more now in this campaign season than ever before of this kind of money in the campaign process.
So Monsanto is one of the most hated companies in the world. And folks campaigning against Monsanto have taken a number of different strategies to try to curb this corporation's influence over our political system and to try to get some regulations placed on their products and ban the ones that are most dangerous. One of the strategies is to label genetically engineered foods. Another strategy that I've just become aware of, I find very inspiring. It's the capacity of a locality, your own city council, your own county or municipality, the capacity of that locality to pass a law that forbids bodily trespass. The most alarming thing is that these chemicals, even if we try to avoid them, Monsanto's chemicals are getting into our bodies. Their genetically engineered genes are getting into our bodies. Their pesticides, their herbicides, their insecticides, we're being trespassed upon. Monsanto is invading our bodies with their chemicals. Similarly, farmers who don't grow genetically engineered crops and farmers who don't use pesticides, herbicides, insecticides that are manufactured by companies like Monsanto, they're being trespassed upon as well. And there is a wonderful model law that's been devised by the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. The Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund has come up with a model law that protects communities from trespass from companies like Monsanto. And any locality can pass a law that makes it illegal for a chemical company like Monsanto to invade our bodies or to invade our environment with their chemicals. So I encourage everyone to go to CELDF.org and to see how localities are already using this model law against bodily trespass. I read an article on their site, a town in Virginia that was very concerned that a new uranium mining operation was going to begin in a neighboring town. They were very concerned that they were going to be exposed to radiation from this uranium mining. So they passed a law against bodily trespass that put the corporation that was engaged in uranium mining on notice that if they become contaminated with the radiation from the mining, they're going to use their law to enforce against that company and stop that mining and bring damages and lawsuits for consumers and the environment in that locality if they get invaded with this radiation from the uranium mining. So this is, I think, an excellent strategy to use in the context of genetic engineering. It's been very difficult I've never heard of a consumer suing Monsanto because their chemicals ended up in their body. And certainly farmers who have been on the front lines of this, farmers trying to grow non-GMO, farmers trying to avoid using pesticides, they are experiencing this trespass. These crops are mostly open pollinated. The wind can blow the pollen over to a neighboring farm, and that farm can be contaminated with Monsanto's genes, or the wind can blow the pesticide and the farm can be damaged by having an herbicide blow over and destroy their crop. So farmers have certainly suffered from this quite a bit, but Monsanto has taken a horrible, aggressive strategy, and so far the courts have not been able to curb this, of claiming that no, the farmers aren't being trespassed upon. They're actually stealing our product that we patented. So we need to turn this around. And I think an excellent way is by passing laws against trespass that target companies like Monsanto that invade our farms and our bodies with their genetic engineering and their chemicals.